Hi there, and welcome to the Explaining History podcast. And today I want to talk about the reactions that Western intellectuals had to Mao's seizure of power in China in 1949. Now, if you've been a fan of this podcast for a while, you'll know that a long time ago I did a podcast on the fellow traveller movement in Britain, America, and Europe during the 1930s. And these were non-communist Western intellectuals who had deep sympathy with Soviet Russia and the development of industrialization there under Stalin's 5-year plans. The fellow traveller movement continued after the Second World War. And the next great experiment that they were able to be in awe of was communist China. The same attitudes seemed to materialize, a kind of a willful ignorance about the violent crimes of the regime and the wanton destruction of the regime, and a desire to go far beyond the call of duty to justify and mitigate the regime's crimes. There was a belief in both the admiration for the Soviet Union and the admiration for Mao's China that something profound and transformative was happening. And in both instances, this projection onto Soviet Russia and Maoist China was a way of Western intellectuals talking about deep frustrations they had with their own societies. But in no instance did they really want to see Stalinism or Maoism replicated in, say, Great Britain or the United States. They felt this was adequate for Russians or Chinese, and perhaps some of the principles of mass state action could be applied, but really that there was no need to bring the entire Maoist or Stalinist program. Not that this would ever have happened anyway. So the book to read on this subject, if it's something that fascinates you, is David Coates' The Fellow Travellers. Coate writes a very stinging account. It's actually quite amusing in certain parts, but a very stinging account of the actions of Westerners, particularly towards China. He speaks about Simone de Beauvoir, the French intellectual and lover of Jean-Paul Sartre. And talks about how she was entirely convinced in 1955, after a 6-week journey to China, that the Maoist project was really benefiting the country. Now, if you read Frank Dakota's The Tragedy of Liberation, he says that by about 1957, something like about 5 million Chinese had already died as a result of the introduction of Mao's policies through violence and famine. The figure that had been quoted quite openly by Chu Enlai had been that 830,000 enemies of the people had been destroyed, he put it, during land confiscation, mass trials, and the roundup of landlords, and the destruction of the old Kuomintang supporters, the Chinese nationalists. And the de Beauvoir didn't even really believe these statistics. She thought a kind of a more realistic statistic was that of 600,000, and this was, in her view, okay. The way she rationalised this is she said that she assumed, she felt sure, she was certain of the fact that there had been fair trials, and that these were just political prisoners. Now, the fact that she justifies this as them being just political prisoners tells you an awful lot about where the radical left intelligentsia was in the 1950s, particularly as exemplified by Simone de Beauvoir, that 600,000, the destruction, which by obviously we must mean death, of 600,000 political prisoners, is essentially a benign thing, given the bigger historical picture that Simone de Beauvoir is considering here. If it were 600,000 ordinary peasants, that might be perhaps bad, but 600,000 political prisoners. Well, any revolutionary at the time might argue that in order for the future to be made, sacrifices of enemy classes and enemy political parties needed to occur. And this shows that the kind of the Hegelian and utopian ideas, this eschatological notion that we're on this upward path towards utopia, but unfortunately, as Hegel pointed out, this path is very bloody indeed. The necessary and unpleasant business of history was being done in China. De Beauvoir said that, in her view, no citizen of China was being bothered on account of his opinions. Coate points out that the next intellectual to give Xu Enlai the benefit of the doubt was Edgar Snow, the American intellectual and writer who had advocated Chinese communism throughout the Second World War, and he said that destruction might not necessarily imply physical liquidation. It could mean, doesn't necessarily have to mean murder. But he also said that this was a very small percentage of the country. He worked it out as being 14 people in every million. I'm not sure of the maths there, but perhaps somebody out there with a calculator can write in. And he said, well, this was okay in a way, it's understandable and justifiable if it means the end to a very bloody civil war in which millions had already died. And it might mean that really former Kuomintang soldiers who were really just bandits in uniform, in his view, could be mopped up and got rid of. And this was all done, in his view, quite judicially. A judge had told Snow that the death sentence was only imposed when a culprit's action had caused the death of a citizen. But that, of course, is a fantasy, and there were no statistics to show that. So let's look very briefly at some of the stories of some of these intellectuals, and perhaps we can draw out of that some of their motivations, because it's very easy to look at the absurd, look at absurd ideas that, to us looking through 21st century ideas, appear to be ludicrous. But without examining them in a context, we can actually develop a misleading picture of our own. So let's not do that. Snow was from Missouri, and he had made it to China in 1927, the year of the Kuomintang's massacre of the Chinese communists in Shanghai. After the Great Northern Expedition against the warlords, it was time in the eyes of Chiang Kai-shek to turn on the communists, as he saw them as the great peril to China, particularly with their links to the Soviet Union. And this was stuff that Snow was all fairly sympathetic towards. He, throughout the early 1930s, drifts towards the left, and in 1936, following the successful conclusion, I say successful, only 8% of Mao's forces ever made it at the end of the Long March, but after the conclusion of the Long March, he manages to make it to Yan'an to actually meet Mao himself in the Chinese Soviet Republic. And it's perhaps these experiences, understandably, that forged Snow's rather uncritical worldview. The Long March, whilst Snow didn't see it firsthand, had really captured his imagination, and he wrote about the adventure, exploration, discovery, human courage and cowardice, ecstasy and triumph, suffering, sacrifice and loyalty, and then through it all, like a flame, and an amazing revolutionary optimism. It was the romance of revolution that he was fascinated with, and I think that there is an awful lot of this when you look at Western intellectuals and the communist world. They don't experience, the horror and bloodshed of revolutions in their own countries. Instead, what they do is they vicariously almost enjoy the passions of revolution and the adventure of revolution as they see it, and also the exciting endeavour, as they see it, of state building, of industrialisation, of 5-year plans, of motivating the entire population to act as one. But what they don't see in all these situations, are those who lose out. They don't see in China and in the Soviet Union the appalling levels of human misery that are generated by these massive, massive transformations, economic and social transformations, and the violence that has to go with it in order to make it happen. The fact that Chiang Kai-shek formed an alliance with the communists in the later 1930s to counter the threat of Japan gave Snow an opportunity to cross from nationalist into communist territory, and there would have been almost no chance of reaching Mao otherwise. One of the interesting things about Snow is that he's passionate about communism in China, and he really did understand China. A great many of the fellow travellers who experienced China knew nothing about the country. There were a great many that knew relatively little about Russia, but China is far further culturally and geographically removed from them. He's actually had a great deal of antipathy towards Soviet communism, and he was also very dubious about the Communist Party of the USA, which really means that his focus is on the economic and social realities of China itself. And he finally returns to Beijing 4 months after his arrival. He gets back in October 1936. The book that he writes, Red Star Over China, is finally published in Britain by Victor Galland's of the Left Book Club, and it was one of their most popular editions. The Left Book Club itself was this means of explaining contemporary issues from a democratic left perspective to a large audience in Great Britain through cheap paperbacks, and it was extremely successful throughout the 1930s, with Red Star Over China being one of their best bestsellers. And what the book does is it, much like Sidney and Beatrice Webb's Soviet Communism and New Civilization, it captures the imagination, once again, of those on the left that are curious about events around the world and curious about the development of the possible development of socialist societies. Another American journalist, the following year, had spent months with the Chinese communists and the Red Army, was Agnes Smedley, who, after spending time with them in immense hardship and often danger, was a passionate convert. And she wrote, "The strength of this army and of the communists who lead it has never been in military force, but chiefly in its intimate, organic connection with the people." Now, a while back, when I did a podcast on the American journalist John Reed and the British journalist Arthur Ransom, both of whom had communist sympathies during the Russian Civil War, one of the things that seemed to really bring them over to a passion for the communists was the way in which the soldiers were treated. The Red Army soldiers appeared to be more treated better in the eyes of both Reed and Ransom, though I doubt it, to be honest with you, than they had been under the Tsar's army. There was a sense that these were men who were cared about, and that the Tsarist army fell apart really because the soldiers were being used as cannon fodder. Now, none of these things I think are factually valid, but it doesn't matter what I think. It matters what people like Arthur Ransom and John Reed thought at the time. And in this case, people like Smedley, for example, could see that within red areas, within communist areas, there seemed to be some kind of efforts towards raising the conditions of the peasants and the peasant soldiers. How effective those efforts were, and the extent to which there were no efforts in nationalist areas, I don't know. And I would imagine that a fairly selective version of things emerged. Whether we look to people like Agnes Medley to be objective reporters of the past, I don't know, probably not. and they are inevitably going to come up with biased and partial visions of things. And I think the question here really is how these visions emerge and why they remain so consistent when they are confronted with huge evidence later on as to the horrific crimes of the people that they're advocates for. And it's in these primary, very personal and actually extremely emotional experiences. They're not based on a great deal of objectivity, they're based on a great deal of emotion for the side that they're rooting for. They see what they view as solidarity and an attempt to raise the condition of the poor, and they like it. It appeals to them. It touches a natural human part in all of us, but also they become very taken with the romance of it all. Following the fall of China to communism, the subsequent Korean War, Snow was unable to make it back to China until 1960. The US State Department blocked his visa, and so did the Chinese government, fearing paranoid about espionage. But he was immensely impressed with what he saw. He said, "Are not all the popular elections an irrelevant facade? The answer must be that they are not." And so he was willing, much like Sidney and Beatrice Webb were, to convey, without a great deal of evidence, confer actually without a great deal of evidence, onto China, just as the Webbs had done with Soviet Russia, the veneer of democratic legitimacy. And from the UK, the socialist Basil Davidson also chimed in with his praise for China. Davidson had been part of the Britain-China Friendship Association, which was formed in 1949 to transmit sympathetic ideas about China to Britain, largely organised by the Communist Party of Great Britain. And the British-China Friendship Association actually becomes far more important after 1960 and the development of the Sino-Soviet split. Davidson wrote that the People's Democratic Dictatorship had nothing in common with Hitler or Mussolini. This was a progressive dictatorship in his view, and that the middle classes were going to be, he said, intellectually remoulded through self-criticism. If he had any understanding, perhaps, of the torture that self-criticism involved, hours and hours and hours of endlessly confessing imaginary crimes to a large audience of people who are being extremely hostile. And you can read again more about this in Frank Dakota's The Tragedy of Liberation. He might have not been so cavalier about it. It's interesting that he winds up in conversation with a former bourgeois Chinese travel guide who said, "I still have selfish thoughts." Now, one of the interesting parallel features of Soviet communism and Maoism was there was this endless attempt to penetrate internal thoughts, to make all thinking collective, about the and anti-bourgeois, therefore thoughts about wanting to eat, wanting to feel protected or safe or loved, or wanting to enjoy some kind of comfort. These were bourgeois, selfish thoughts, and only selfless thoughts were permissible, which is kind of pretty impossible for a human being to achieve. The role, therefore, of individuals in Maoist China and in Soviet Russia was ideally, and though this doesn't really work out in most cases, to be the policeman of the self. Basil Davidson came to some extraordinary conclusions about China. He said that there was essentially no need for striking because there was a society in harmony with itself, spiritual unity and harmony. Because communism was, of course, about unselfishness in his view. Similarly, Davidson was impressed by the intellectual freedom that he found. He said, "Most of the intellectuals you meet are manifestly at their ease, full of projects for the future, and unobsessed by fear of sudden sanctions or some shadow-like terror in the background." Again, most documentary evidence would strongly suggest this is manifestly not the case. Go back if you need to and listen to the 100 Flowers campaign podcast that I did, I think last year sometime, and that'll give you a picture of terror against intellectuals. Davidson was taken to see a range of model villages, factories and schools, and there were obviously reliable guides and translators to show him around, much as the Webbs and other fellow travellers had been taken around on the Grand Tour in Russia in the 1930s. But Simone de Beauvoir particularly fell for it. She was taken to see a prison, and this was a prison where a real performance is put on for her, where former sinful bourgeois types are rehabilitated into good Chinese proletarians. And she said she believed it was not a model prison. She thought this wasn't a performance, this was standard stuff. It was simply the only one in the city area, and for that matter in the province, and all central prisons are the same in China. A extreme assumption. The prison that she visited had no locks on any doors, study programs, vases with flowers, a hospital, and it was really almost a movie set that she'd been taken to. It was referred to as Prison Number 1 and was a standard part of the tour for Western visitors. And Davidson had visited it too. Simone de Beauvoir was very keen on finding out about the status of women in China. The Marriage Act in 1950 had made a big difference to women. Child marriage, arranged marriages, and infanticide had been, if not eradicated, then certainly outlawed. And she was angry at Western propaganda that presented Chinese communism as an enemy of family life. She believed that a kind of a moderate revolution had taken place in China, if anything, and that instead of family life being destroyed, the kind of the iniquities of bourgeois life had gone, and that an inequality and a civility had developed in place. She said that there was a stirring and reasonable revolution, and in Beijing, nobody is arrogant, nobody is grabby, and nobody feels himself above or below anybody else. So it was a similar picture to what was seen during visits in the 1930s to Soviet Russia. Now, I don't want to go on and talk about the Cultural Revolution in this podcast because it'll take a heck of a long time. But it's something I hope to return to, because ideas about the Cultural Revolution, when they are transmitted to Western audiences, they have a far more profound effect. You actually find Western intellectuals engaging with ideas about the Cultural Revolution during the revolutionary upheavals in Europe, particularly in France in 1968. But that, as they say, is another story. Okay, well, I hope you found that useful. If you're teaching at the moment and you're looking for new inspirational ideas and handy stuff to do with your pupils, free resources, go to my new site, www.outstandinghistory.com/instant-access, and I'll place the web address underneath this podcast. All the best. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.